It's Wednesday, April 13th, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, the emotional challenges that come with taking a journalism job far away from family and friends. We'll introduce you to ACE reporter Hilde Lysiak. She's only 9 years old, but she's breaking big news stories in her Pennsylvania hometown, and some thoughts on the end of American Idol. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but we're going to start with the news a year from now, as predicted by the Boston Globe. Maybe you saw it this weekend, the fake front page designed to show us what life might look like living during a Donald Trump presidency. The lead story is about Trump calling for the tripling of immigration forces to enforce mass deportations. On the right rail, markets sink as trade war looms with Mexico and China. Go down page, you're going to find a headline that says, U.S. soldiers refuse orders to kill ISIS families. And this one is my favorite. Libel law targets absolute scum in press. This is meant to be a cautionary tale, a twist on the traditional editorial. Did you think it worked?
Yeah, you know, sometimes I think journalists try too hard to be funny, and maybe you should just leave that to comedians. But this time, I actually thought it was kind of funny. Now, it wasn't the front page of the paper. It was the
fake.
Front of the, what is it, the ideas section of the paper, and it was fake. But, I mean, my favorites were like, there was a story comparing Trump naming a Shar-Pei after the First Lady of China. I thought that was pretty funny. Or naming Ambassador Kid Rock to Japan and him being censored. That was kind of funny. Was it in keeping with the reputation of the Boston Globe? Probably not, but, you know, everybody's on the lookout now for some way to stand out, and at least for a day or two, they did.
I think that's what they were trying to do. I mean, it's one of those things where you have journalists doing satire. I think they put it in the right place. I think it was unusual. Some, I think, longtime readers would probably say, okay, that's going a little bit overboard. This is not what I would expect in my traditional newspaper. But I think as some of the people who have been looking at what they did pointed out that it's one of those ways newspapers are going to have to remain relevant, reach new audiences, be able to do something different.
Well, when you mentioned reaching new audiences, you talked about the idea of the loyal readers of the Boston Globe and them seeing something a little bit different, but this went so much further than that. This became viral content that did bring new eyeballs to it as well.
Well, and it kind of takes a page from some of our digital first media. You think of the Huffington Post, for example. For a while, they relegated Trump to the entertainment section, and now they run that little disclaimer or editor's note at the end of every Trump story, basically calling him a misogynist and a liar and a birther. So, I mean, that's that kind of stunt that you see more from the digital first press than the traditional press. And, you know, it can work for a little bit. It does get some social media traffic anyway.
And I think it's one of the ways in which newspapers, or at least the Boston Globe in this case, is trying to sort of show that there's another way to tell a story. There's another way to reach an audience. And there is some information in those stories which basically says this is what he believes in. This is what he's been saying, and that reaches another audience to sort of those who used to watch Jon Stewart in The Daily Show and John Oliver and that crowd, I guess you would say.
It's kind of safe for the Boston Globe to do this. It's a liberal city and a liberal state with a liberal audience mostly and a fairly liberal editorial policy. So, you know, people kind of expect it. What I thought was kind of a little unexpected in the letters to the editor and the online comments, and there were, you know, several hundred of those, it kind of broke down on party lines, but there were also a lot of people who were saying, this is kind of funny, but the media are responsible for Donald Trump, much as we've talked about on the show for a lot this past season. You're the ones that give him so much attention, so you should talk about that too.
And I think this is another way for him to get that kind of attention. And I think it's a way that both brings humor to it, but also sort of gives people some information about here's what the types of stories you may see if some of his policies come to fruition. Now, the whole thing about increasing the immigration and customs forces and that sort of thing, I think that was definitely satire, because I can't see any way that's going to happen, especially when you start talking about the fact that the Republicans tend not to want to increase budgets.
Well, but that idea of a trade war with China and Mexico, I mean, that is all completely feasible. Well, there was this, too, a Kansas City Star editorial that, given all of the questions swirling around the Republican National Convention with worries about protests and violence, that the city dodged a bullet in losing the convention to Cleveland. The editorial picks on Cleveland, calling the city the mistake by the lake, something we've heard before, but it also says that Cleveland has more to lose by hosting the thousands of Trump supporters than it does to gain. And as you might imagine, that's not sitting well with people in Cleveland. Here's a snippet of a commentary segment with anchor Leon Bibb at WEWS-TV, the ABC affiliate.
The editorial hints at possible riots in Cleveland, with hundreds of arrests and injuries tarnishing this city's image. The convention isn't even here yet, but a city which could not win it is writing irresponsibly about Cleveland, which did win it. The editorialists are playing pretty loose with their writings. I report stories with truth when and if it unfolds, not before. The Kansas City Star website editorial writers have done a hatchet job in characterizing Cleveland as possible scene of widespread violence because of the Trump controversy. That is not journalism. It's something else, which decorum keeps me from describing, especially on television. Something else. Don't call Cleveland the mistake on the lake, as you did. We won a national convention, a political party convention. Mistakes don't win that. Kansas City, you wanted it but didn't get it. Is that what your editorial is really all about?
So what do you think? Is this a duel of civic pride, or Kansas City really dodged a bullet here?
Well, I think it's just basically what you said. I mean, this is a civic pride thing. It's Cleveland basically saying, wait a minute, we're not going to let you tarnish our image because you didn't get the convention. I mean, we weren't thinking about who was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party when we presented our bids, and neither were you. We were trying to get something that we think is going to bring economic development to our community.
I'm going to be even more cynical. I think this is just another attempt at clickbait for the Kansas City Star to get some social media buzz. And the problem with it is it falls flat. And the reason it falls flat, because there was no humor in this, like there was in the thing we saw with the Boston Globe. There was no humor in that response from the Cleveland television station anchor either. It just, lighten up, take a joke. And I thought the only thing that was funny about it, there was a comment, strangely enough, on the Kansas City Star's site attributed to a Clevelander who basically said, we could swallow your city whole and still have room for a beer. Now that's funny. The rest of it wasn't very funny.
I mean, and actually, when you let that play on and they go back to the anchors who are on the set, they took it a little step further and they started making.
They had a little bit more fun with it.
Yeah, they had a little bit more fun with it, but then they started making digs at Kansas City. But I mean, I have to agree with Mike. When I first read the editorial, I got to thinking, was this a slow day and you needed something to write about? Because it just didn't make much sense to me as to why you would write that to begin with. I understand that you're trying to, keep Kansas City relevant, but to use Cleveland and Trump to sort of make that point, I just didn't see that.
And does anybody seriously believe that the city of Kansas City or the Kansas City Star wouldn't love still to have the convention
have
there,
that story
especially
to cover
with
if
Trump?
It happens?
I definitely wouldn't be surprised if during the next cycle they try to either get the Democratic or the Republican convention again.
Okay, well, we've talked recently about the changes expected down at the Capitol in Jefferson City and how reporters will eventually be kept from the Senate floor. Well, you know how they say it can always be worse? It is in Arizona. Here's Howard Fisher of the Arizona Capitol-Times.
We were told that unless we signed certain forms waiving our rights to have not just criminal background checks, but civil background checks, prior residences, driving records checked, and agreed to allow the House to decide that certain offenses make us unfit, we would be denied floor privileges. There was a decision among the reporters who cover this place that the things they wanted were totally unnecessary, inappropriate, and in fact far more extensive than sought by the White House, by the U.S. Congress, and by the Secret Service for covering the president. Therefore, our floor privileges were revoked effective this morning, and we are now here in the gallery. We will not be kept away. This will make our jobs more difficult, but we will not be dissuaded from covering the House.
So reporters now covering the House in Arizona are sitting in a gallery like any other member of the public in a balcony above the floor. The members of that chamber claim that this is out of fears for their safety, that a disturbance not created by a member of the press gives them reason to fear what could happen to them if anybody who's not a member of the House of Representatives or one of their direct employees were to be on the floor.
Yeah, to me, this is another argument for suppression of the press. I mean, we had the same issue at the beginning of the legislative session here in Missouri. The reason then was that you had members of the press who were listening in on various House members' conversations and then taking that information and running stories with it. And in this case, you've got some member of the House or the Speaker of the House concerned about his safety or the safety of other House members. But in the end, what it leads to is that the press does not have access to talk to members of the House or members of the legislature who are voted in by the people, the citizens of that area, and we are acting as a conduit for them to receive that information. And I think it's just one of those things where they're trying to control the flow of information, and this is one of the vehicles they're using to do that.
I mean, it's a pretext, it seems to me. Is it true that it's possible for somebody in the House gallery in Arizona to create a security or safety problem? Sure. I mean, they had some protesters there after the legislature didn't appropriate enough money to have enough polling stations opened a few weeks ago at their primary. People came in and were pretty boisterous about that. But everybody in the Arizona House knows who those reporters are. They are not the ones who are going to cause a security problem. And it just so happens that one of the reporters who did a series of stories about the House Speaker there and about how he had some sketchy use of money, guys running for Congress, had to give some of that money back to the state. Well, it just so happens that that reporter was convicted of a misdemeanor trespass involving apparently a bar fight a couple of years ago. And one of the categories of crimes that would keep a reporter from being able to sit in the House was trespassing. So it was targeted at that reporter.
I'm starting to wonder whether or not because it seems like they pull back, they get this initial push, and then the press pushes back, and then you have some members within the legislature who will basically say, whoa, wait a minute, I think we're going a little bit too far, and then it sort of dies off because the same thing happened here in Missouri, it's happened in Arizona. I think you're seeing that happen around these state legislatures. Someone is hoping that one of these things will pass and it will stick, and then that will be a precedent that's set that could be followed around the country. And to me, this is where I think you need to have press associations get together and really start focusing in on who's actually pushing these things, why are they pushing them, and in other words, what makes legislators think that by barring the press from doing their jobs, that's going to be advantageous to that particular political body and to, I guess, the democracy at large.
Well, one of the commenters on one of the stories that's listed on our links blog had said that, one of the ways to get back at those legislators, if I'm an editor at any one of those publications, I just throw my hands up and say, to heck with you, we're not going to cover you at all then. We're not going to cover your campaigns. We're not going to cover your press conferences. We're not going to cover whatever it is you want the coverage on, because when we want to be there, you're limiting us. Is that a tack that you would consider taking, or is that the wrong way to go?
I mean, I think it's the wrong way to go, but I'll say this much. It seems like there's a pretty active press corps in Arizona covering the state legislature, which is not the case in a lot of states these days. We've talked about this several times on this show. State government reporting has fallen by the wayside in a lot of places, and journalists have got to figure out how to cover state governments better and more effectively, not get into some kind of shouting match with legislators.
Yeah, my response to your question is that the way to go? I don't think so, because what happens is that the business of the state, the people's business, is not being thoroughly investigated, thoroughly covered, so that the people know whether or not the legislators are doing their jobs. In other words, are you doing what we, the people, sent you there to do?
And that's the whole idea behind the Fourth Estate. That is our reason to be here, is that other set of checks and balances outside of the exact role of government. For a lot of people getting into our profession, moving far from family and friends for the job is just a part of life. And it can be hard, especially for young journalists learning how, as the kids say, to adult at the same time they're trying to establish themselves as professionals. That's what makes this next story that much more sad for me. Last week, we learned about Russell Byrd. He did the weather at KTVZ in Bend, Oregon. He was new in town, not really making friends, and not making a lot of money either. At 27, he was starting to think about what would be next for him and looked to a Facebook group of other weather forecasters for advice. And several people offered some to him, including WQAD-TV's Eric Sorensen, who suggested he get a dog, someone that he could come home to after work each day, someone who would be happy to see him. Well, Byrd was found dead in his apartment not long after that. Generally, in this industry, in our profession, we don't cover suicides out of fear of maybe it appearing as though we're glamorizing it or potentially giving people the idea of copycat. Instead, we try to connect people with help. We try to connect our audiences with resources. But this keeps resonating with me because Byrd did call for help and people offered it to him. And we're at a time right here, right now, in the middle of April, when we're helping our students looking for and connecting with their first job, sometimes making big moves across the country, too. What do you say to them?
Well, like you said, it's just sad. I mean, it's a really sad story. I mean, it's true that in small market television, the salaries are terrible. The working hours are terrible. You know, being away from home and trying to find friends is very, very hard to do. We can't blame this young man's suicide on that. I mean, there are thousands of people in the same situation who don't contemplate or carry something like that out. But it does shine a light on just, I mean, at this day and age, people who are expected to be giving us important information and they can't make a decent living, they can't have a decent life. I mean, that's been true for 40, 50 years, and I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon, but it's just sad.
To me, I think it also, you need to look at the importance of having mentorship in these first jobs, having people who are in management positions or editor positions, staying in contact, checking on people, making sure that it's not just about the work life, it's also about the personal life. And quite often, especially in these beginning jobs, you have small staffs and people tend to get disconnected, and by the time someone connects with them, in some cases it's too late. And so I think this is a perfect example, or this should be an example for managers in small newsrooms, be they in broadcast, digital, print, you name it, to begin to look at what are the steps that we're taking to make sure that we're looking at the entire life of the people who work for us, not just what they do in front of the camera or behind the camera or doing work hours, but what's happening when they're not here.
Especially in a small market where people are always in flux. There's a constant migration, and it's like a carousel of people in and out. So as soon as employees may have some kind of a bond or develop some kind of a friendship outside of work, one person may be moving into their next contract and moving on, and people are in and out of each other's lives so quickly.
I've got to say, though, and this doesn't solve the problem of small markets, and we need journalists in small markets, but frankly, if you want to avoid that kind of situation, at least the salary and what that does to your ability to have a life and make friends or whatever, frankly, anybody who's contemplating going into the media business these days ought to get a job in where they have the skills to do social media and multimedia and can leapfrog over some of these places and actually make a living wage and get a good start to their career and their life.
Okay, well, it's not often that the executive editor of the New York Times comes out and comments on the inner workings of the paper. It's even more rare for him to acknowledge weaknesses in the process or product. Yet that's what happened this week when Dean Baquet wrote on the Times Press Run blog that the New York Times is too often clumsy in handling issues of race and gender. It all links back to a story from last Wednesday about Gay Talese. Actually, it goes even a bit further back than that, to the first of the month when he was at a conference and he was asked which women writers, aside from Nora Ephron, inspire him the most. Talese stumbled and didn't really answer the question, starting a steady stream of angry responses on Twitter. What happened from there?
I mean, what happened from there basically is that you had people who were coming to his defense saying during his time period, at least the time period they were talking about, there were very few women journalists, women writers who he basically could look up to or could identify with, and many of them were fiction writers and that sort of thing. But then you had others who were saying that, the way in which he said it sort of showed his chauvinism, his sexism, and his disrespect for what women are trying to do in journalism, and so I think it's sort of a two-person argument or two-reason argument that just makes no sense to me at all.
It was, in some ways, you could say it was a one-sided story. It tended to favor Talisa's point of view. On the other hand, it's a whole lot more complicated than that, because what really got the New York Times executive editor upset was the fact that one of their prime reporters, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was here just a couple of weeks ago. She's a fabulous reporter, fabulous speaker. She was called out, and she got into a little scuffle or whatever with Talisa at this event, and she was not quoted in the story. But wait a minute, because one, the story was in the fashion and style section of the New York Times, not the politics section or whatever, and there was a freelance journalist who wrote that piece, not a New York Times staff member like Hannah-Jones. And so she reached out to Hannah-Jones. Hannah-Jones would not comment for the story, and so you couldn't put her side of the story into the piece. So I'm not exactly sure what the freelancer did wrong. I would say this falls on an editor.
Well, that's exactly where I was going.
I think the editors.
I think it does fall on an editor here, because when you're dealing with the freelancer, the editor has a lot of work, should play a larger role in where that story goes, how that story is framed, what questions need to be asked and answered, and if that's not done, then that editor has the right not to run that story. And I think what Dean Baquet was basically saying was, we probably should have held this until we did some more reporting on this, and maybe gotten a response from Nicole about what exactly happened, and maybe get some responses from others who happen to be at this event as well. Yeah.
Okay, one of the things we pride ourselves on here, training young journalists. Well, I want to introduce you to one of the youngest neighborhood beat reporters I've ever seen, 9-year-old Hilde Lysiak.
Hi, Hilde Lysiak here from this Orange Street News. I'm here at the Sealands Grove Commons again. But when just yesterday I did a breaking news story on the vandal ripping up these trees. It seems like they did it again, except this time ripping up multiple. As you could see here, just after Sealands Grove finished cleaning up the mess, the vandal had to do it again, ripping up the plants out of their pots and scattering dirt all over.
Hilde runs the Orange Street News with some help from her parents, and while most of her content centers on vandalism in her Pennsylvania hometown, recently she came upon some spot news and broke the story before grown-ups.
Hilde Lysiak here, reporting from the Orange Street News on the 600 block, where a man suspectedly murdered his wife with a hammer.
That was a third grader holding her handwriting textbook covering a murder investigation in her neighborhood.
Well, I mean, I don't know if a 9-year-old should be at a murder scene or not, but I mean, she comes by.
Oh, come on. Her mom says, where could she possibly,
right?
Right. And as her mom said, where could she possibly be more safe than a murder scene where there are cops around?
I have to say, though, I mean, this is great. I mean, she's getting out there and doing the news, and she's using social media. She posts all these things on YouTube. There were people who were complaining about it, and I loved her response to the complaints. So she gets her sister, I guess, to help tape another piece, and she said, if you want me to stop covering the news, then you get off your computers and do something about the news. Is that cute enough for you? Good for her.
I mean, it's one of those things where, and you don't see this in, I guess you'd say, in a real adult journalism, where the reporter actually responds to the comments, or the trolls, as we call them, who are making all these comments. And she just came right out and said, hey, I'm going to do it, and if you don't like it, then you can do your own. But I really, I like her spunk. And the
She's
fact
got
that
spunk.
The fact that in these communities, that kind of vandalism matters because, I mean, this is real money that people are spending to plant their trees and somebody's going around and pulling them up. And in the real adult news isn't covering it, but I'm pretty sure that the people who are living in that community really cared about it.
So there's that news value of proximity,
yeah.
of impact.
Yeah, and she's doing it, and it's fun to watch. I mean, you know, she's really going after it. And it's like, you know, we need to do something about this, to the point where she actually shows up at the police station and talks to the police chief about the vandalism. And I think that, at least from the stories I read, that's pretty much how she made contacts to find out about the murder that it took place. She worked the beat.
She made sources.
Could that have been you at 9 years old?
No.
No.
Maybe 12. Yeah, maybe that's it. Before we go, a word on the end of an era, a television competition show that, frankly, is kind of synonymous with the 21st century.
This is American Idol. Here we go.
15 seasons, 11 judges, and tonight, American Idol sings its swan song. Megastars, past winners, and former judges gathered one last time for the finale. Even the president sang its praises.
It inspired young artists and captivated audiences across the country. And it taught America what it means to be pitchy.
Mike, you're our Idol fan. What does it mean to be pitchy?
Well, it just means that you're not singing in tune, and that's what Simon Cowell used to always criticize some of the singers of. Why do I know this? I've watched all 15 seasons of American Idol, I must confess, and I watched the finale, and it was a phenomenon. I mean, in some ways, it was a very American kind of show, because it wasn't experts picking talent. It was the American people voting on talent. And sometimes those people actually made real singing careers. Most of them didn't, but, you know, Carrie Underwood did, and a whole lot of other people did. So, you know, good for them. Every show like that runs its course, and it's run its course on Fox. It was overtaken by The Voice, for example, on NBC. There are very few of those kinds of shows that can have a long run. One of them that does, Survivor, another one of those shows that I've watched, is still strong in the ratings. It's been on as long as American Idol, but I think American Idol did something really important for American television.
Well, I mean, I have a question. Do you think that these types of shows are waning, or are they still, you know, popular?
There are a variety of different kinds of competition shows, and reality TV is still kind of popular, but you're seeing a comeback as a lot of us watch a lot of the shows, binge-watching shows on TV and on Netflix and other places. So I don't know how long they'll last, but I think people always liked having the ability to have a say in how celebrities perform.
Okay, well, that music means we're just about out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can learn more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's on KBI's website at kbia.org under the Programs tab. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, to leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next time, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. Pat Akers handled the audio for us today, and Chelsea Vaughn is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next time when we're with you for another edition of Views of the News.